Welcome to PW English YouTube channel. I'm Shalini Somashekar, your botany teacher. I welcome you all to this lecture in the UMEED NEET English batch. In today's class, we are going to be discussing the chapter Ecosystem in one shot. And regarding whether you should refer the old NCERT or new NCERT textbook for this chapter, I would suggest you refer the new NCERT textbook. Earlier, this chapter was lengthy. It had a lot of interesting concepts which are deleted after the syllabus got rationalized. For example, you had ecological succession, nutrient cycling and all of that, which is now deleted. It's deleted for your CBSE board exams as well as for NEET 2025. So it's ideal if you can refer the new NCERT textbook for this chapter. Next, analysis of how many questions have appeared from this chapter in the NEET exams over the last few years. So you can see a range between 1 and 3. Last year in 2024 was when there was rationalized syllabus, the small syllabus, the cut down syllabus. Before that you had like the entire chapter including ecological succession and all of that. So last year there was one question asked from this chapter. So you can expect like 1 or 2 questions from this chapter in the upcoming NEET 2025 exam as well. So let's get started without any further delay. The name of the chapter itself is ecosystem. And I've told you what ecosystem is in our previous lecture itself. In organisms and populations, we did discuss the various levels of biological organization. We started off with macromolecules, then we spoke about cells, tissues, organs, organism, population, community, ecosystem, then biomes, biosphere, all of that. There I had already told you what an ecosystem means. Ecosystem is one of the levels of biological organization where we take into consideration both the living or biotic components as well as the non-living or abiotic components. So in an ecosystem, basically we're studying about how interaction is taking place between these different components. So you know how living organisms interact with each other, right? And we also interact with our surrounding environment. All of these interactions that take place among living organisms and also between living organisms and non-living things is what we refer to as ecosystem. Okay, so you know how we say that cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life, right? Similarly, in nature, ecosystem is considered as a functional unit. Okay, so ecosystem is a functional unit of nature where living organisms interact with each other and also with your abiotic physical environment. Functional unit, why? Why is ecosystem a functional unit? Why can't community be a functional unit? Why can't a population be a functional unit? For nature to function, just living organisms will not suffice. If living organisms have to survive, we need the abiotic environment also. Can you survive without water? We can't. Water is abiotic. Can plants survive without sunlight? They can't. Sunlight is abiotic. We can't survive without taking in oxygen or breathing, which is essentially oxygen that's coming into our lungs from the atmosphere. Air is not living. It is an abiotic component. So for our survival, abiotic component is also essential. For nature to survive, for nature to function, abiotic components are as important as living or biotic components. So since ecosystem is the first level in biological organization where both biotic and abiotic components are considered, we say that ecosystem is the functional unit of nature. Think about all of the levels that come before ecosystem. Macromolecules, cells, tissues, organs, organism, population, community. Up until community, we're not even talking about the abiotic components, just living cells and different types of structures in living organisms. It's only in ecosystem level that we bring in the abiotic component. And without that abiotic component, nature cannot survive, right? So that is the smallest unit which is capable of functioning. So that's why it's called the functional unit of nature. All right. Now, the size of an ecosystem varies greatly. Something as small as an aquarium also can be considered as an ecosystem. Something as large as a desert also can be considered an ecosystem. Forest is also an ecosystem. A garden is also an ecosystem. So there is no specific size that an ecosystem should have. There are many different ways of classifying ecosystems. We have to learn about 2 such classifications. In the first type of classification, we will classify ecosystems based on where they are located, based on the location. If they are located on land, then we call it terrestrial ecosystem. If it is located in water, we call it aquatic ecosystem. No rocket science, everybody knows terrestrial means land and water means aquatic, right? So an ecosystem found on land, what are some examples of ecosystems that you can find on land? We have grasslands, we have deserts, we have tropical rainforests, we have temperate forests, and you have a lot of different types of ecosystems that you can find on land. What are the different aquatic ecosystems? It could be a pond, it could be an aquarium, it could be a river, it could be a sea. All of these are aquatic ecosystems. Now let's talk about the second type of classification. The second type of classification is based on whether there is human interference in that ecosystem. Okay? If there is no human intervention, then you call it a natural ecosystem. If you see there is human intervention, then you call it an a man-made ecosystem. All right. Now, example for natural ecosystem would be a forest or an ocean. Let's take a terrestrial natural ecosystem, for example, forest. In a forest, no man goes and decides, here's where I want a, let's say, a shrub. Here's where a sandalwood tree probably would look nice. Maybe a mango tree there would look good. Here there should be pink colored butterflies. Here let there be ladybug beetles. Nobody decides, right? A forest happens by itself. What species grow there, what species thrive there, you and I cannot decide. You and I don't decide. That is naturally happening. That's why it's called a natural ecosystem. As opposed to that, if you think about a crop field, your own piece of land, right? It could be a garden or it could be like your own crop field, agricultural field. If I have my piece of land, my agricultural piece of land, I will decide what crops should grow there. I will decide what insect pollinators I want to attract to that place. I will decide which plants I'm going to pluck out, which weeds I'm going to remove, which insect pests I'm going to eradicate. All of that, what species will thrive in that area, what species are allowed to grow in that area is under my control, right? I decide there. There is human intervention there. So over there, such ecosystems you call man-made ecosystems. Even if you take a garden as an example. In a garden, there are certain trees which probably give a lot of shade that are planted onto the sides. Here and there will be few flowering plants which produce nice, brightly colored flowers and probably some fragrance also. So I decide where which plant grows. There is human intervention. So that is called a man-made ecosystem. If you talk about aquatic natural ecosystems, think about oceans. Nobody decides what species grows in oceans, right? You and I don't decide it. It is nature. As opposed to an aquarium, you do not want to, grow or have pet fishes that are not aesthetically pleasing. You do not want to, have fishes at home that are not beautiful to look at. Of course, in oceans, you find many different kinds of fishes. Some of them are scary looking. Some of them are very bland, boring, grayish, no fancy colors. Oceans will, have all types of fishes and all types of organisms, regardless of whether it looks pretty to human eyes or not. But if you want to have an aquarium in your house, you have certain characteristics based on which you will decide which fish you will take home, right? So over there is human intervention. That is the primary difference between natural and man-made ecosystems. All right, now let's move on. See, I've already mentioned 150 times that an ecosystem includes both biotic, living and abiotic, non-living or physical components, right? In an ecosystem, these living components, biotic components and abiotic components constantly interact with each other. This also we are aware of. Now, depending upon that interaction, you have different types of ecosystems. Desert is an ecosystem and tropical rainforest is an ecosystem. Both of these are two different kinds of ecosystems. Now, what differentiates a desert from a tropical rainforest, let's say? What differentiates these two types of ecosystems? Firstly, the kind of species that you find there. Because of the kind of interactions between biotic and abiotic components, each ecosystem has its characteristic flora and fauna. The moment I mention a desert ecosystem, I'm sure you'll think of cacti, you'll think of palm trees, you'll think of tumbleweeds, you'll think of camels and kangaroo rats and snakes and other sorts of reptiles. And you will think of like a water scarcity, you will think of sand everywhere. These are things you associate a desert with. The moment I say tropical rainforest, you will think of lush greenery, so many different types of trees, so many different types of insects and animals that live there. Now, for each ecosystem, there is a characteristic species composition. Now, what is a species composition? What is composition? It's a general English term. If you look at any medicines in your house, like it could be any syrup or any tablet strips, you will see composition written there. And over there, you will find a mention of all the different chemicals that are present in that medicine, in that syrup or whatever. It's basically like ingredients in your food, right? So composition is what it is composed of. Apply the same thing to species. What should a species composition mean? Species composition is all of the different types of species that you find in that particular ecosystem listed. That gives us the species composition. So because of these interaction between biotic and abiotic components, there is a characteristic physical structure and a characteristic species composition for each ecosystem. Okay, and that's about the characteristic living component of an ecosystem. Talk about the abiotic component. The moment we say desert, I told you, you will think of sandy soil, you will think of very high temperature, very little water. And the moment you say, I say tropical rainforest, you will think of a lot of different trees, right? Different types of trees and different kinds of heights. So because of this interaction between biotic abiotic component, a physical structure also results in ecosystems. One example for that is stratification that you see in tropical forests. This is a characteristic physical structure for a tropical forest where you find plants growing in different layers. There are plants or huge trees that grow very high, and then there are trees that are slightly shorter, and then there are trees that are even shorter, then there are plants that are even shorter, then there is vegetation that you see like grasses and little plants and herbs towards the surface of the soil. So you have vertical zones forming like this. Strata means layer, right? So strata means layer. You find different layers forming, and why has it formed? Why has that physical structure formed? That has formed as a result of the interactions that are constantly happening between biotic as well as abiotic component. All right. So each ecosystem has its characteristic physical structure, it has its characteristic species that you remember. And what is causing that species to grow there? That is because of the interaction between biotic and abiotic components. I've been telling you that ecosystem is the functional unit of nature. For ecosystem to function as a unit, there are certain functional aspects that are at play constantly. There are 4 of them. The first one is productivity. The second one is decomposition. The third one is energy flow. The fourth one is nutrient cycling. Okay, so we learn all about this in detail as we move on. Not all of this. Nutrient cycling we used to teach earlier, but after rationalization, this part of the chapter is deleted. So you'll not learn much about nutrient cycling. First, let's talk about productivity. What is productivity? Basically producing organic matter, synthesizing new organic matter, at what rate that happens, that is called productivity. For example, plants use sunlight to synthesize food. Something is being synthesized inside a living organism. That is called biomass. So that organic matter that is synthesized, at what rate it is getting synthesized, that is one type of productivity. So in nature, you see that productivity, every organism, like even plants are photosynthesizing, they are synthesizing food, we are synthesizing DNA, there's proteins that are forming inside our body, we are also synthesizing something. Take a microbe for example, even in its body, some things are getting formed, like it's probably building a protein, it's creating or replicating its DNA, making a new DNA molecule. So some organic mass is getting synthesized in all of us. that at what rate it happens is called productivity. Okay. Secondly, we have decomposition. What happens to all of us when we die? When we die, we decompose, right? Plants or animals, any living organism that dies, we will break down, our decomposition happens, and whatever nutrients were present inside our body are sent back to the soil so that the uh, plants can make use of it as nutrients and grow. Okay, so it's a circle of life. Today I'm eating a plant, but one day after I die, my nutrients will go back to the soil and it will help in growing. I mean, it will help plants to grow. Like utilizing the nutrients from our body, plants will grow, right? So, yeah, that's decomposition. And then we have energy flow, which is the third component. It's right here. Okay. So, what is energy flow? Very direct flow of energy. Where is energy flowing? To where? From one trophic level to another trophic level. How does that happen? By means of food chains. Now, there is some amount of energy present in a plant, right? It has certain carbohydrates, it has certain nutrients present in it, which can give us energy, right? So, it has some energy. When a buffalo or a goat goes and feeds on that plant, the energy that was a part of the plant is now transferred to that goat or buffalo, and then when a tiger or some other animal goes and hunts that and feeds on it, the energy that was present in that particular animal gets transferred to the next trophic level. So this way energy transfer happens across trophic levels. We learn about that as well. And lastly, nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling is basically how between biotic and abiotic components, several nutrients get cycled. For example, carbon. Carbon dioxide is present in the atmosphere. Plants take it in, they convert that into glucose, and then when we respire, we eat plants and we respire, we give out carbon dioxide. Fossil fuels contain a lot of hydrocarbons, and then when they are burnt, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. So this is a cycling that happens between the atmosphere, which is abiotic, and us, which is biotic component. Likewise, there is nitrogen cycle, there is phosphorus cycle, where different nutrients cycle across biotic and abiotic components. All right, more details about that you don't have to learn because it is deleted. The others we'll discuss in detail. How exactly all of this helps in functioning of an ecosystem, we will learn keeping the example of a pond. Pond is also an aquatic ecosystem. What is pond? Pond is a water body that's not very deep, it's just a shallow little water body. In a pond, you have different abiotic components and you also have biotic components. What are some of the abiotic components that you can see in a pond? Of course, pond is a water body. There will be water present in it, right? We have water. And is this pure water? It's not pure distilled water. It will have a lot of organic and inorganic nutrients dissolved. What else do we have? We have this sediment or soil at the bottom of the water body, right? There is soil present, and this soil will be rich in nutrients, right? What else do we have here? We have sun, there is air, and of course also there is variation in temperature, day length, and all of that. So these are the different abiotic components that you can find in a pond ecosystem. Talk about the biotic component. Do you see any producers here? Of course, there are producers. What are these producers? Producers means organisms that are capable of performing photosynthesis and synthesize food. Okay. So you have many different algae and phytoplankton growing on the surface of water, right? So they are considered producers. Which are the producers? you have phytoplankton floating on the surface, you have algae, and then there are plants that float on the surface of water. There are plants that are submerged and grow deep inside the water body. There are plants that grow towards the margin of the water body. Let's call them marginal plants. All of these are your producers. What about consumers? What kind of animals do you find here? What kind of animals do we find here? You have zooplanktons, okay, that feed on the phytoplankton. You will have certain fishes. There are animals that can grow at the bottom of the water body. We call them benthic forms. So there will be certain benthic animals at the bottom of the water body. And then we have decomposers. Okay, what are these decomposers? They are your bacteria, fungi, and certain flagellates. Okay, they will be present at the bottom of the water body. Now, in this just one small ecosystem, we can see how all of these functional aspects are playing a role. Okay, so first let's start with the first functional aspect, productivity. These producers make use of the sun's energy, sunlight, photosynthesize, synthesize new organic matter. So, productivity is taking place. Next, second, decomposition. If the plants and animals that are growing in this water body die, they will settle at the bottom of the pond. At the bottom of the pond, you have decomposers that will act on it, perform decomposition, and release the nutrients into the soil so that the plants can utilize them to grow. Decomposition is happening. Energy flow. Energy flow is energy being transferred from one trophic level to another that happens through food chain. So the plants, phytoplankton that are here are consumed by animals. One animal, another animal feeds on that. So that is how energy transfer also takes place. And of course, between the biotic, abiotic components, nutrient cycling is a continuous process that happens. Okay, so these are the different functional aspects. Whatever I've explained to you right now, I've listed it down. What are the different abiotic components? What are the biotic components? Everything is listed here for your reference. You'll get it in the notes. Now we'll in detail explore the various functional aspects of an ecosystem, starting with productivity. Over here, we first have to learn about what production is. We'll learn about primary production. Whenever you hear the term primary, you must associate it with plants. You know, plants perform photosynthesis. As an end product of photosynthesis, glucose is synthesized, right? Glucose is organic matter. We consider that as biomass. How much amount of biomass a plant synthesizes or produces through photosynthesis, that is called primary production. Plants make use of sunlight, synthesize their food. How much amount of it is synthesized, that is called primary production. The amount of biomass or organic matter produced per unit area over a time period by plants during photosynthesis is called production. How do we express it? It can be expressed in terms of weight or in terms of energy. If we are expressing it in terms of weight, how do we express it? If you're taking 1 meter square area, that is the area that is considered, we'll express it in the form of this much gram per meter square. If we are considering the parameter of energy to express it, we will say X amount of kilocalories per meter square. Okay, so it can be expressed either in terms of weight or in terms of energy. Next, we have productivity. What is productivity? Productivity is the rate at which this biomass is getting synthesized inside the plant. Again, that also can be expressed. When we talk about rate, time comes in, right? At what rate means per year or per hour, how much is getting synthesized. Conventionally, we consider it over a period of 1 year, annually, okay? So if you're considering 1 year period, what was the productivity? Then if you're expressing it in terms of weight, it would be X grams per meter square per year. If it's in terms of energy, it would be X kilocalories per meter square per year. That is how you would express it. Alright, that's about primary productivity. I hope you're clear with the difference between production and productivity. Production is how much amount is being synthesized per unit area. Productivity is at what rate it is getting synthesized. Okay, now this primary productivity is of two types. Gross primary productivity, abbreviated as GPP, and net primary productivity, which is abbreviated as NPP. Gross primary productivity is the overall rate of biomass synthesis in a plant. Now think about it. Why do you think plants synthesize food? Plants don't make food so that we can go and eat them. The reason plants are synthesizing food is because they also need food to survive. They are self-sufficient. They know the trick. They know the magic to use sunlight itself to prepare food. And they're doing it for their own energy requirements, energy needs. Now, how much ever food a plant prepares, all of that will not be available to consumers. Some amount of that biomass the plant utilizes for its own needs. You all know that cellular respiration is a process that takes place in all living organisms. Can you recollect and tell me what happens during cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is a process which gives us energy, which yields energy. During cellular respiration, energy-rich molecules are broken down and ATP synthesis happens. Now, even in plants, respiration will take place. So, by photosynthesis, whatever organic matter they have synthesized, some amount of it they will also use, because to survive they need energy, right? For so many metabolic activities, energy is required. Where do they get that energy from? From the food. We get it from the food we eat. They get it from the food that they have synthesized. So, in whatever amount of photosynthesis they performed, whatever food they have synthesized, one portion of it they will utilize. They will break it down for their own respiratory needs, for their own energy requirements. Whatever they make use of is what we call respiratory loss. Okay, gross primary productivity is the overall rate of biomass synthesis. In that, some amount the plant uses for its own respiratory needs. That is called respiratory loss. Now, what remains? That is called net primary productivity. You may have heard about gross and net in terms of salary when your parents or somebody you know is talking. Gross salary is how much we should get. Of course, after that, there will be a lot of deductions like we have to pay income tax, we have to pay professional tax and all of that. And finally, in your hand, what you get after all those deductions is called your net salary, right? Likewise, over here, overall rate of biomass synthesis is gross primary productivity. Some of it is used up by the plant itself. Whatever remains is your net primary productivity. Both gross primary productivity and net primary productivity are related to plants itself. Remember, whenever you hear the term primary with respect to productivity, you should immediately understand that it's about plants, okay? So, gross primary productivity will always be higher than net primary productivity. From gross primary productivity, you subtract the respiratory loss. What remains is your net primary productivity. So, NPP is basically GPP minus R. R here stands for respiratory loss. So, this NPP is what is available to us when we eat plants. Okay, not everything is synthesized. It's synthesized is available to us because some of it the plant has utilized for its own needs. What is available to a consumer that feeds on it, that is net primary productivity. Now let's talk about secondary product. Okay, let's understand what are the various factors that affect primary productivity in an ecosystem. See, productivity generally, when you talk about productivity generally, not with respect to ecosystem and environment, if you want to check or compare the productivity between two different people, two different teachers, you will check for how many hours in a day can they teach for, how good they are with the content, how well they can deliver a concept to the student, and all of these. Okay, so if I am productive, then I can engage in more classes during a day. Let's compare two teachers A and B. Teacher A can in one day take classes for 6 hours. Another teacher can take classes for a maximum of 2 hours. So we say that teacher A is more productive compared to teacher B. Talking about the same thing with respect to students, compare the productivity of two students. The one who can stay focused and study for longer, of course, will be considered to be more productive than another student who lacks focus and can't sit still for long, right? They can't study for long. That way, even for plants and even for ecosystems, when you compare the productivity, you're basically comparing how well they can photosynthesize. What is primary productivity? It's basically about how well a plant can photosynthesize and how much organic matter it can produce, at what rate it will produce that. That is its productivity. And between two different ecosystems, productivity will definitely vary. And what are the factors that will determine how much productivity, primary productivity you can see in an ecosystem? We'll learn about that. There are many factors that affect it. Firstly, the plant species inhabiting that particular area. See, if you have plants that are huge with a lot of leaves, which are tall and they get a lot of sunlight, then in an ecosystem that has many such plants, their productivity will be higher compared to an area where you don't have many plants and you have very small plants that cannot photosynthesize very well with small leaves. Then obviously in that ecosystem, productivity will be less. Second, environmental factors. Is the sunlight sufficient? Are they getting sufficient amount of carbon dioxide? Is there sufficient water present in the soil? Are the nutrients in the soil sufficient for them? These are some factors. Okay. Finally, photosynthetic capacity of plants. You know how there are two different types of plants, C3 plants and C4 plants, depending upon which pathway they follow during photosynthesis dark reaction. So you know how C4 plants are better, have more photosynthetic ability compared to C3 plants. So if that ecosystem has more C4 plants, then probably over there the photosynthetic output also will be high, primary productivity also will be high. So these are some factors which will determine the productivity of a particular ecosystem. So that's about primary productivity. Now let's talk about secondary productivity. Whenever we say secondary with respect to productivity, we are talking about heterotrophs or consumers. Now when you eat a plant, let's say we're eating some rice, okay? So when you eat rice, in rice there is starch. When you eat starch present in rice, does it remain starch in your body? It doesn't remain starch. You're eating protein, you're eating dal, let's say. Dal has protein. So when you eat that dal, does the protein remain protein in your body? It doesn't. What happens? As you eat your food, as it goes down your alimentary canal, in different regions of the alimentary canal, different juices are released, different gastric juices and enzymes are released, and they break down our food. What was starch in rice will be converted to glucose by the time it reaches your small intestine. It will be broken down, right, by a series of enzymes. What was protein when you ate dal will be broken down to amino acids by the time it reaches your small intestine. So from the small intestine, all of these small molecules, the amino acids and the sugars, will be transferred to the blood. It will be carried by the blood and transferred to every part of your body. It will be transported to and sent to every one of your cells through your blood vessels. So what happens in your cells? In your cells, you're receiving amino acids. You're receiving glucose. Within your cells, you have to bring together these amino acids and make a protein again. You have to bring together these glucose units and make glycogen again. So inside of our cells, we are synthesizing polysaccharide freshly. We are synthesizing proteins freshly, right? So whatever fresh biomass that we synthesize in our body, whatever consumers produce again, That is your secondary productivity. Okay, so the rate of formation of new organic matter inside our body. Every time cell division happens in our body, DNA replication will happen. DNA replication means another molecule of DNA is forming. So that DNA molecule forming is new biomass synthesized in my body, right? So the rate at which new biomass gets synthesized inside the bodies of consumers or heterotrophs is what we refer to as secondary productivity. Okay. Now, if you compare the net primary productivity, NPP of the whole world, of the entire biosphere, it is about 170 billion tons per year. Annually, it is 170 billion tons of dry weight organic matter. Now, if you look at the earth, it's mostly, like majorly filled with water. 70% of our planet, I suppose, is oceans, and you have comparatively little land mass. Even though the oceans occupy such a huge area on our land, the net primary productivity of oceans is just about 55 billion tons. Whereas on land, the productivity is as high as 115 billion tons. In terrestrial ecosystems, why is it so? Water is more, so productivity over there has to be more, right? Not really. I told you there are a lot of factors that affect productivity, especially primary productivity. It depends on what kind of species you find there, how much available is sunlight. Think about land, a lot of sunlight is available, especially near the tropics. You have many different types of tall plants and trees that can be more productive. Whereas in oceans, only in the surface, whatever photosynthetic organisms, free-floating planktons and algae are there, they will mostly contribute to the primary productivity. Beyond certain depth in oceans, light cannot even penetrate. Without light, photosynthesis cannot happen. So in the deeper parts of the ocean, there are literally no plants. So photosynthetic output is less in water bodies like oceans. Therefore, the productivity is much higher, net primary productivity is much higher on land in terrestrial ecosystems. Now let's move on and learn about decomposition. This is the second functional aspect in an ecosystem. What is decomposition? It is a process. What is happening in this process? Something is getting broken down into something. Something complex is getting broken down into something simpler. Okay? What is getting broken down is complex organic matter. What is it getting broken down into? It is getting broken down into simpler inorganic substances such as carbon dioxide, water, and other nutrients. Now, for decomposition to happen, a raw material is required. For something to get broken down, a raw material is required. If there's nothing, then what will get broken down? You need organic matter to break down, right? If it has to be broken down, organic matter has to be there. Where is this organic matter? This organic matter is present inside living organisms, right? So whenever living organisms die, like a whole organism dies and falls on the ground, a plant falls on the ground, or just a twig of the plant or a leaf of the plant is falling onto the ground, that we consider as the raw material for decomposition, and we call it detritus. Any dead plant or any dead remains of plants such as twigs, leaves, little part of the stem, all of this, dead living organisms, even excreta of organisms, that is considered as detritus because it will be rich in organic matter. That is what will act as a raw material for the decomposition process. How exactly does this decomposition happen? Let's understand that. Now, there are 5 important steps in decomposition. The first step is called fragmentation. Now, let's say a leaf has fallen onto the soil. A leaf from a plant has fallen onto the soil. Okay, maybe this color may not be very visible. I'll use orange for soil. Let's say there is soil. And on top of the soil, a leaf has fallen from a tree. Now this leaf is the detritus. There will be worms inside the soil like the earthworm that will start feeding on this detritus. It will start breaking it down. It will feed on it and it will start breaking it down. The process by which the earthworm is breaking down the detritus into smaller fragments is what we refer to as fragmentation. Very simple, right? Fragmentation is making fragments. Cutting it into pieces. So that's the first step. Now, after fragmentation, let's say fragmentation has happened, there will be some inorganic nutrients released inside the soil. Inorganic nutrients that were part of the leaf. Because of fragmentation, it is now released into the soil. Let's say there is rain. If these inorganic nutrients are water soluble, they will dissolve in water. It will get dissolved in water and move. Let's say there's rain, okay? It will dissolve in water and move towards the lower layer of the soil, and it will not be available for plants anymore. These nutrients will go down to deeper layers of the soil and it will precipitate there as unavailable salts. They precipitate here. Unavailable for whom? Unavailable for plants if they grow there. Let's say there's any plant that is growing here, its roots are there. So this will go so deep within the soil horizon that it will not be available for these plants. It will get precipitated as unavailable salts. This process is called leaching. Now what happens next, or another step that we can see here in decomposition, is called catabolism. Catabolism. So what happens during catabolism? What happens? In the soil, there will be many heterotrophic microbes. There will be fungi and there will be bacteria, let's say, right? Let's label it. Fungi are present. Bacteria will be present. They will also act on the detritus. Okay, so these will release enzymes. They will produce enzymes and that will help in breaking down the organic matter present inside the detritus. Now all of these three processes are not happening one after the other. They are all happening simultaneously. They all happen simultaneously. It's like if a leaf falls on the soil, you can't say like earthworm will feed on me first, until then bacteria and fungi, please wait. It doesn't work like that, right? In the soil, there will be earthworms. In the soil, bacteria, fungi are present. If there is water there, then dissolution of inorganic nutrients in water and leaching down, all of that will happen simultaneously. Okay? So these are the three steps that will happen simultaneously. Over here I've written it as 1, 2, 3, but it's not like fragmentation. Only after fragmentation leaching will happen. Only after leaching catabolism will happen. Okay? So fragmentation happens because of organisms like earthworm, which are called detritivores. They will break down the detritus into smaller fragments or particles. Leaching. Whatever inorganic water-soluble nutrients are there, they will get dissolved and go down the soil horizon and get precipitated as unavailable salts. Catabolism. Enzymes released by bacteria and fungi degrade the detritus into simpler organic substances. What happens after that? Two more steps are there. Humification and mineralization. What happens during humification is, I'll show you. Next, humification. You have the soil, leaching, catabolism, all of that is happening. Whatever detritus we had, that will start getting converted. The detritus will start getting converted into, let me use a different color, a dark amorphous substance that is called humus. This humus will degrade very slowly. It is very resistant to microbial action. It acts like a reservoir of organic matter in the soil. It is colloidal in nature. Alright. So, this dark amorphous substance humus forming is what we call humification. Next, eventually, this humus also will get degraded with the help of microbes and its enzymes. And that last step is called mineralization. In mineralization, whatever organic matter is present in the humus, that will get degraded and it will form inorganic molecules. It will form inorganic mineral nutrients. And this happens with the help of microbial enzymes. This is the final step. We started with organic matter present in detritus or the leaf, and towards the end we have got inorganic nutrients from it. So, the process is complete. Okay? Humification is the accumulation of a dark colored amorphous substance called humus. It is highly resistant to microbial action. It undergoes decomposition at a very slow rate. It is colloidal in nature and acts like a reservoir of nutrients. Mineralization is the humus getting degraded by some microbes and released as inorganic nutrients. Okay? So that's about decomposition. Now let's understand what are the different factors that affect decomposition. Firstly, it is the chemical nature of the detritus. If the detritus is made up of substances like lignin and chitin, it will be slow. If it is made up of sugars and nitrogen containing compounds, then it will happen relatively faster. Temperature. The temperature has to be warm. It shouldn't be too hot, it shouldn't be too cold. Next, moisture in soil. It has to be moist, right amount of moist. Too much water and too little water is not good. Just the right amount of moisture has to be present. In moderate quantities, moisture has to be there. Lastly, oxygen. If oxygen is more, it is fast. If oxygen is less, it is slow. Why? Because microbes that are acting on the detritus require oxygen. Decomposition is an oxygen consuming requiring process. So these heterotrophs will not be able to efficiently break down the detritus or the organic matter if there is not sufficient oxygen. If there is no oxygen, there is anaerobiosis, then it will be very slow. Okay, so these are certain factors that affect the rate of decomposition. Now, let's talk about energy flow. Now, this is the third aspect that keeps an ecosystem as the functional unit of nature. So, you know how sunlight is the ultimate source of energy for all ecosystems except for a few like deep sea hydrothermal vents where no sunlight reaches at all, it's complete darkness. Except for such very few ecosystems, in most of the ecosystems, sun itself acts as the ultimate source of energy. So sun's radiation hits the earth and plants utilize what is available to plants is less than 50% of it. Okay? If you consider the electromagnetic radiation that reaches the earth from the sun, of course you have the visible wavelength between the 400 to 700 nanometers. Apart from that, you have UV rays, X-rays, gamma rays, infrared rays, radio waves and all of these things. Now plants don't have the ability to absorb every wavelength of electromagnetic radiation that hits the earth, right? Plants have the ability to only observe the wavelengths of light between 400 to 700 nanometer. We call this the photosynthetically active radiation. In short, it is called PAR. Alright? Now, this PAR is less than 50% of the whole electromagnetic radiation that reaches the earth. All of this is not utilized by plants. Again, roughly 2 to 10% of this is what plants absorb and perform photosynthesis. So the sun's energy is absorbed by the plants. They utilize that energy and convert it into chemical energy, synthesize glucose and also other biomolecules, right? Now, whatever energy is present in the plant doesn't remain in the plant forever. Not necessarily a plant, whatever energy is present in any living organism does not remain in that organism forever indefinitely. What happens? Let's say there's some energy present in the plant because of the kind of biomolecules it has, because of the carbohydrates and all of these energy rich molecules it has. If a cow comes and feeds on that plant, that energy is transferred to the cow. Let's say the plant, no organism fed on that plant, it eventually died and fell on the ground. So it becomes detritus and microbes will get the energy from decomposing it. Alright, ultimately, whatever energy is present in an organism will be transferred to other organisms and cannot even forever stay in that same organism. Okay, what will happen if it goes through, see there's two different types of food chain. If an animal like a cow or a goat or some herbivore feeds on that plant, energy is transferred to it by means of the grazing food chain. If it dies and falls on the ground, then detritus, it becomes detritus and detritivores and other bacteria, fungi, microbes will act upon it, decompose it and then it will become a part of the detritus food chain. So all animals will depend on plants either directly or indirectly for their nutrition, right? If they depend directly on the plants, then we call them herbivores. This is a term that you know already. If they consume or if they are dependent on plants indirectly, then we call them carnivores. So, all the plants that are capable of synthesizing food are called producers. If an organism directly feeds on the producer, you call it a consumer, primary consumer. If they are indirectly dependent on it, for example, if it's like a lion will not directly feed on plants, right? Lion will kill and hunt and eat a deer, but the deer would have been dependent on the plant. So, lion itself is not directly dependent on a plant, it's dependent on another animal which is dependent on a plant. So, indirectly it's dependent on a plant. In that case, we call it secondary consumers. Alright? Yeah. Now, these are terms that you should remember. I told you there are two different types of food chain. First type is called grazing food chain. In short, we call it GFC. It always starts with producers. Okay. So, over here you can see grass. It is a producer. There are grass grains or some rice grains or whatever here. A rat will feed on it. Rat is directly dependent on this plant, so it's a primary consumer. Snake feeds on rats, so it is a secondary consumer. Then an eagle feeds on the snake, that is the tertiary consumer. Okay. A grazing food chain always starts with plants or producers. How is it formed? Because one organism feeds on another organism, they are dependent on each other for food, there is interdependency. Because of that, food chains arise. The second type of food chain is called detritus food chain. It always begins with detritus and decomposers. Okay, so it begins with dead organic matter, which is nothing but detritus itself. So what is this detritus food chain made up of? It is made up of decomposers. Decomposers like bacteria, fungi, detritivores like earthworms, it is made up of all of that. At some points, the detritus food chain will be connected to the grazing food chain. Okay, see for example, there is detritus here. This detritus is fed on, fragmentation happens because of earthworm. Bacteria and fungi also act on it, but this earthworm, which is part of the detritus food chain, can be a prey to an animal in the grazing food chain. If a sparrow feeds on this, then you can see how they are both interconnected, right? Now, let's compare aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. In both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, you can see that energy flow takes place. In aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, there will be grazing food chain, there will be detritus food chain, because if you see, of course, on land you see there are plants and there are herbivorous animals feeding on it. So grazing food chain, of course, is happening. Even in water bodies, you have phytoplanktons and other sorts of plants and algae that animals feed on. So grazing food chain is happening in water bodies as well. Organisms are dying, detritus is getting decomposed on land, it is happening even in the aquatic environments. Though both happen in both places, the major channel for energy transfer on land is detritus food chain, and in water it is grazing food chain. In both places both happen, but majorly on land it is detritus food chain, because decomposition, I told you what are the conditions that are required for decomposition. I said how the temperature has to be warm, I said that there should be sufficient amount of oxygen, and it depends on a lot of chemical composition of the detritus and all of those factors. The conditions present on land are more favorable for decomposition compared to in water. Okay, so there also detritus food chain happens, but it is not the major channel for transfer of energy. In aquatic ecosystems, grazing food chain is the major conduit, and in terrestrial ecosystems, detritus food chain is the major conduit. Okay, remember this. All right. Some of you might get confused and think there is more plants on land, so it's probably grazing food chain on terrestrial ecosystems, but it's not true. DFC is the major conduit of energy in terrestrial ecosystems, and in aquatic it is grazing food chain. Okay, now let's talk about energy flow, continue, and learn about an important term called trophic levels, which you're already aware of, right? In your lower grades also you may have learnt about trophic level. What is a trophic level? Every organism occupies a specific place in the food chain. Now what does that depend on? It depends on the source of your nutrition. Are you eating a plant? Can you synthesize your own food? Are you directly dependent on plants or indirectly dependent on plants? How do you obtain your food? Based on that, we have different trophic levels. All of the plants that are capable of synthesizing their own food, all the producers, always by convention will belong to the first trophic level. Animals that are directly dependent on plants, which are primary consumers or herbivores, they will belong to the second trophic level. Organisms or animals that are indirectly dependent on plants, they are carnivorous, they belong to the third trophic level, and so on. Okay, it depends on the food chain. In the first trophic level, you have producers. Second trophic level, you have primary consumers or herbivores. Third trophic level, you have secondary consumers or carnivores. Fourth trophic level, you have tertiary consumers or your top carnivores. There are different examples of food chain that I've given to you here. Alright, about this one we've already discussed. Like that, similarly, you have an aquatic food chain also given here, grazing food chain. There is euglena, which is eaten by this mussel, which is further eaten by a smaller fish, which is further eaten by a larger fish, and so on. Alright, so depending upon what is your source of nutrition, you will occupy a specific place in the food chain, and that is called the trophic level. Okay? At each trophic level, there is a certain mass of living material, a certain biomass present, and there's a specific term that we use to denote it. It is called standing crop. At any particular time, consider a trophic level. The biomass present in that trophic level is called the standing crop. For example, in the first trophic level, these are the organisms. What is the biomass of that? That is the standing crop of the first trophic level. Like that, what is the standing crop of the second trophic level? Would be the biomass of the animals belonging to the second trophic level. That is called the standing crop. Okay? It is measured as the mass of living organisms or biomass, or even in terms of number. The biomass is expressed either in terms of fresh weight or in terms of dry weight. Dry weight is more reliable, more accurate, because fresh weight includes water weight and that varies according to the environment. Okay? Now, let's talk about energy flow. Something very important, 10% law of energy transfer it's called. Now, we have been learning that every time an organism consumes another organism, energy from that organism is transferred, right? All of the energy present in one trophic level in one organism will not be transferred to the next trophic level. Only 10% of it will be transferred. The remaining 90% is lost, either in the form of heat or for whatever metabolic activities, it will be lost. So only 10% of the energy that is present in one trophic level will be passed on to the next trophic level. For example, you have this plant. This plant is eaten by this worm. 10% of the energy present here only will get passed on here. Most of it is lost as heat. Then this has some amount of energy. This sparrow feeds on this bird feeds on this worm. Only 10% of energy that is present here will be transferred to the next trophic level. A lot of it is lost as heat. So this is called the 10% law of energy transfer. This is the reason why you don't have too many trophic levels in a food chain. Maximum tops in a grazing food chain, you can have like 5 trophic levels, not beyond that. Because eventually for organisms in the higher trophic levels, they will have to eat a lot of food because they're not getting the same amount of energy present in the previous trophic level, right? The number of trophic levels in a grazing food chain is restricted as the transfer of energy follows the 10% law. Only 10% of the energy is transferred to each trophic level from the lower trophic level. Okay, remember that, it's very important. Now let's explore ecological pyramids. Ecological pyramids are basically constructed keeping several parameters in mind. We could construct ecological pyramids based on numbers, based on biomass, based on energy, all of these. Okay, so what does this do? What does this ecological pyramids help us understand? It is used basically to express the food or energy relationships between organisms belonging to different trophic levels. Okay, these are the 3 types of parameters that we usually study: number, biomass, and energy. There are certain assumptions that we make or certain things to keep in mind while constructing ecological pyramids. Whatever calculations we are making, it could be in terms of number, biomass, or energy. If you are constructing an ecological pyramid for an ecosystem, in that trophic level, whatever organisms are there, all of them have to be included. Sometimes one given organism can occupy more than one trophic level simultaneously. Over here, the trophic level represents a function, okay, not a species level. I mean functional level, not a species as such. Okay, so I'll explain to you what this means. Consider a sparrow. A sparrow feeds on nuts also. A sparrow feeds on some worms also. Now, sparrow is one species. I cannot say that the sparrow will always be in the second trophic level. It could be in the second trophic level or the third trophic level depending upon what it is eating. If it's eating seeds and nuts, it will be in the second trophic level. If it's feeding on worms and other animals, then it will be in the third trophic level. So one species, it's possible for it to occupy more than one trophic level depending upon what it's feeding on. Also, that is the reason why we say for one species, you cannot say that it will belong to this trophic level at all times. It is not, trophic level is not specific or fixed for a particular species. It is just a functional level and depends and could change depending upon what that organism feeds on. Alright? Now, let's understand the first type of pyramid, pyramid of number. By convention, in all pyramids, you will have at the base producer, first trophic level, and then primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and so on. Okay, so this is a pyramid of number. How wide a bar is will depend on what is the quantity or what is the amount of the parameter we are considering. If the number of producer is more, the bar is going to be wide. If the number of producer is less, it's going to be narrower. Okay. So here is a pyramid of number in a grassland ecosystem. You can see how in a grassland, of course, the number of grasses is going to be crazy high. So the number of producers obviously will be very high, right? The number of grass plants, if you start counting, is going to be very high. According to this, it's around 58 plus lakhs. Primary consumers are your herbivorous organisms. It includes your deer and your antelope and different types of buffaloes and bisons and cattle and all of that. So that is obviously will be less than the number of plants there are. So that's roughly around 7 lakhs. And then you have secondary consumers, which are your third trophic level. They are like wolves and hyenas and all of that. So that's around 3.5 lakhs. And then you have the top carnivores, which include your lion, tiger, and those kind of organisms. So they are only 3. So you can see how the width of each bar here becomes narrower and narrower because the numbers are going on decreasing as you move higher up the trophic levels. So this kind of pyramid is called an upright pyramid. Generally, pyramids of numbers are going to be upright, but there are some cases where they could be urn-shaped also. For example, I told you in the beginning that an ecosystem doesn't necessarily have to have a specific size. Alright? Even a tree itself can be considered as an ecosystem. If you consider a huge tree itself as an ecosystem, there's only one producer, right? On top of that producer, there could be many insects. So the number of insects is much higher. Lesser than the number of insects will be the number of animals dependent on insects, like small birds. Lesser than that will be the large birds that are dependent on the small birds. So you get like an urn-shaped pyramid in this case. Generally, they are upright, but sometimes they could be urn-shaped or even inverted sometimes. Okay. Now let's talk about the pyramid of biomass. This is also generally upright, as you can see here. Upright generally in most cases. Here we are looking at a pyramid of biomass in a forest ecosystem. Of course, if you're talking about a forest, you have a huge number of large trees. So, of course, the biomass of them are going to be very high. Here, the biomass is measured in terms of dry weight, which is kilograms per meter square. So, you have per meter square 809 kilograms. That is how much the biomass of producers is in a forest. In comparison to that, the biomass of consumers in the second, third and fourth trophic level will progressively decrease. So we will get like an upright pyramid. But consider the same for an aquatic ecosystem, like let's say in a sea. If you see, the number of producers might be very high, but that's not what we are considering right now. We are considering the biomass. The weight or the biomass of all the plants put together will still be much lower compared to all of the animals there, right? The fishes and all of them are much larger compared to plants or photosynthetic organisms. So over there, the biomass of producers is going to be less compared to the biomass of consumers. So you get like an inverted pyramid in that case. Talking about the pyramid of talking about the pyramid of energy, it's always going to be upright. Okay, why is it always upright? Because of the 10% law of energy transfer. Now look at this. There's about, how much is this? 10 lakh joules of energy in sunlight. Roughly about 1% of it is utilized by plants. There is 10,000 joules of energy. 10% of that is transferred to the primary consumers, 10% of it to the secondary consumers, 10% of it to the tertiary consumers. Therefore, the next trophic level will always have less energy compared to the previous trophic level. That is the reason why the pyramid of energy is always going to be upright. If it's number and biomass pyramid, it is generally upright, but it could be inverted or urn shaped. But if you consider a pyramid of energy, regardless of which ecosystem it is always 100% of the time going to be upright. Okay. Now let's take a look at the last slide for this chapter. Are there any disadvantages of these ecological pyramids? Yes, there are 3 limitations. The first one is that if there is any organism that is any species that is belonging to 2 or more trophic levels, like the sparrow that I mentioned, they are not given any place here. They are not taken into account. Secondly, in these ecological pyramids, they assume a simple food chain, but in nature, it's not simple, like it's not a simple food chain. Many food chains are interconnected, form a network or a food web. So it is oversimplified over here in ecological pyramids because it does not accommodate a food web. Thirdly, we know how saprophytes are so important in our ecosystem. If not for them, there is no decomposition or cycling of nutrients that will happen. But they don't have any place in the ecological pyramids. You saw how we considered only producers and consumers, and there were no place for decomposers or saprophytes. So that is the third limitation over here. And that's all. With that, we are ending the chapter. We have one more last chapter left, which you will be hopefully getting tomorrow. Okay? And then we'll finish the syllabus in UMEED NEET batch, right? We are finishing the syllabus. Are you finishing the syllabus? That is a question mark. Let me know in the comments how well your preparation is going on and where you have any, challenges, and how we can help you so that we can take steps in that direction. All right. So I hope this chapter is clear right now. You've understood everything. I'll see you again in the next class. Until then, don't stop studying. Keep working really hard and all the very best. Thank you.